All right, everybody. Hello. It's Saturday, April the 6th. Um, so Venus has ingressed into Aries since I made my last video, and before that, Venus was in a conjunction with Neptune. And this is one of those things where there's a certain dynamic with Venus and Neptune. Um, but I was kind of busy with another idea, and I just kind of like didn't get into that. But I would just like, before getting into this one, I would just like to say it was interesting, the whole dynamic with this Pisces stellium, because we have Mars applying a conjunction to Saturn, and we've got this solar eclipse coming up in Aries, right? And Aries is ruled by Mars, so this Mars Saturn conjunction has a lot to do with this eclipse. But then in the same sign, you also had Venus and Neptune, and there's something weird about having Venus and Neptune and Mars and Saturn all together in the same stellium in Pisces, um, because there's something about Mars and Saturn that can seem kind of like frustrating or a bit of friction or kind of like an obstacle, and then but Venus and Neptune, there's something about it that has a kind of like soothing, calming effect. And I mean, I didn't make a video because I think other astrologers did a good job of this, and it's sort of, I didn't really have anything to add, right? But there's something of even like just like I make music, I make electronic music, and like that day when the Venus Neptune conjunction was exact, I was playing. It was kind of interesting, just like let your creative process without trying to like, I'm gonna specifically try to make this like Venus Neptune, but it's just, you just naturally kind of tune into that vibration, and it sort of takes on this different quality that would be there if that, like, and it's just like it comes off in a way that's much more kind of smooth and easy and kind of soothing. It's almost like a spa thing with Venus and Neptune, right? But I'm basically mentioning this because Venus is just ingressed into Aries, and it's kind of funny because it's sort of like that whole influence. It's like Venus is the exaltation ruler of Pisces, and Jupiter is the domicile ruler of Pisces, and with it's like there's this whole kind of tension in Pisces, and with Venus, when Venus was in there, it was kind of having this soothing effect on the tension, right? But at the same time, there's some other dynamic that I noticed that was maybe more, you could say, the shadow, right? The not so positive was that like things which were like trying to be, well, let's just, I don't know. The idea that came to my mind was like the hot dumpster fire. Like this doesn't look good, but there's sort of like Venus is trying to smooth it over, and you're like, or there's something, or it's something to do with, like Venus in Pisces is exalted and is kind of making it work, but it's dealing with these malefic planets that are like a mess, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's a mess, but and now Venus isn't there, and it kind of feels a little bit like it's like having a soothing medicine to help this out, and now you're off the medicine, and you're like, oh, I still kind of am sore from this Mars Saturn thing, right? That is like one way to look at it. But the thing is that Venus is in Aries, and I mean the thing is Venus is in detriment in Aries, and there's going to be an eclipse coming up soon. But at least there's some mutual reception going on if you use exaltation rulers for mutual reception. But anyways, I just wanted to get that kind of out of the way first before going on to more of these Aries themes, right? And this is very much relating to this eclipse that's coming up soon. Now, there's something about Venus and Mars, obviously. Now, there's certain things going on where I was kind of like, this whole issue about the masculine and the feminine, or the yin and the yang. And one of the things about this is that in this context, Venus stands for what you like, what you're attracted to, and then in contrast, Mars is kind of like aversion. It's kind of like the friction or the conflicts that come up with the stuff you don't like, right? Um, and but there's something about this that's like when you factor in this thing about Aries being the first sign of the zodiac and having to do with springtime, and if you read the old ancient astrologers like Manilius, they talk about the Aries having a signification to do with youth, like the young lamb, or you know, like the young animal, and so because of this, people are. I've noticed this. A lot of astrologers that I follow emphasizing the idea of a new beginning having to do with the North Node in Aries, because Aries has to do with this youngness and this newness, right? But at the same time, well, there's something that's been coming up for me recently, and you know, one of the things is that I've decided, like a while ago, I decided to take my astrology channel in a certain kind of direction, right? Which had to do basically, well, I mean, if you really want to know, it's because there are interests that I have that don't, like, I was taking some astrology courses and studying astrology for a while, but I kind of basically ran into this thing where when it comes to astrological, like learning the techniques, the technical side of it, I started getting into, you know, I bought some books, like here's some example, like, I haven't been using these books very much, but like these Ben Dykes books, like on the solar revolutions, like Abu Mashar, or like the, you know, I also got his like Bonatti book that on horary, and it's like, unless people actually hire me to do solar return charts or hire me to do horary readings, it's, and like I have to like apply these techniques, like they're not really, you know, there's not, I don't personally have much demand for really getting into these nitty gritty details of these, like the really technical stuff of how astrology was done, either in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages or in ancient, like learning basic Hellenistic astrology as a foundation. I found was good enough for like the technique part of it. But I am kind of motivated as a self learner, and I've been reading all kinds of stuff, and there are things that I'm doing things where I'm bringing stuff into my astrology videos that people normally don't bring into, and I don't know, you know, if I just kept this very much like on, you know, if I conformed to what other astrology videos are like and I left all these other influences out, I might I might do way better with the algorithm. I may get a lot more popular, right? But the thing is, for me, part of my I mean, I could be my own astrological influence as a Sagittarius. I kind of have this kind of attitude where I don't really care that much about getting popular. I care more about doing, like, I had this spiritual teacher that I saw, and she always used to just tell me, Dan, just do what lights you up, right? You gotta, like, and there's something about the fire, right? Which is like, follow the fire, or like, where's the inspiration? What gets you going, right? And I have to say, I've been really just enjoying learning, like reading Deleuze and Guattari. And there's certain things that like I don't know if it, you know, it maybe throws things off a little bit to start talking about Deleuze and Guattari in my astrology videos. But there's a certain reason why, you know, there's reasons why I'm doing this specifically, rather than just trying to go off and, you know, try to make philosophy videos or something, right? But one of the things about this is because I was thinking about like doing these videos about this eclipse that's happening in Aries, right? And for one thing, this whole thing about how the youthfulness of Aries and this whole emphasis on a new beginning. And a lot of like what I'm doing as I'm kind of coming up with what I'm going to say in these videos is that I'm remembering what I did last year. I made a video last year for the solar eclipse in Aries. And of course, the thing is, this one is a total solar eclipse, so it's a stronger one. But the thing is, it's like when you have eclipses, you have a like you have a series of eclipses. You don't just have one eclipse and then it's like on, we had one it's like over an 18-month period basically. And not only that, but you also have the opposing sign, Libra. And Libra, whereas Aries is the beginning of the zodiac, Libra is the middle of the zodiac. And so there's just sort of like, the eclipses aren't just about like, it's about the polarity between the two opposite signs, and then the lunar eclipse and the solar eclipse, and then the seasonal opposites and things like that, right? But one of the things that I'm kind of like, first of all, is that I'm like going back to some themes that I already talked about last year, because we're not in the beginning of this eclipse cycle. We're actually in the middle of an eclipse cycle, right? And Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus have this idea about starting from the middle, right? And what they mean by starting from the middle is that, oftentimes, like, they talk about it in terms of, like, let's say an addict, right? Like, a person is, like, has an addictive pattern. Let's just, like, maybe it's just like, Alcoholics Anonymous thing, right? That they feel like they've messed their life up and they need to get out of this pattern and then start from scratch, basically, right? And I also kind of relate to this because there's certain periods of time in my life where I had built something up in my life, like, and then like a crisis happened and it seemed like it all fell apart, and it was like this feeling like I gotta just start from scratch again. I just gotta it's funny because I also had friends that I noticed who would like do this thing where they would like, I mean, I don't know, I'm not gonna judge people for their, people are managing their situation the best they can, and I'm not going to make any judgments about it, but I just noticed that it is a pattern. Like, I had and I mentioned in my other videos that I had certain mental health concerns, and there's a kind of like area of danger or risk involved where I've noticed that when it comes to things like the esoteric and the occult, is that there's a certain hazard involved where either it attracts people who are a little bit crazy to begin with, or else if people don't have the right, I don't know, I can't really say exactly what it is, but some people have some sort of weird thing where they kind of like binge and purge, where they get really into it, and then they're like, this is not a good influence on me, I've just got to get rid of all this stuff. And I knew this guy who like had to like get rid of all his books, or he'd do these things where he would like build up an identity, and then this identity isn't working for me, I just have to throw it all out and start from scratch. And just seeing him do this with, this, like, picking one, this is going to be the thing that's going to save me, and then putting all your investment into it, and then when you start to get this doubt that maybe this isn't going to be the thing that's going to save my ass, then you have to bail on it and go all the way back to zero and start from scratch again, right? And what Deleuze and Guattari were noticing this pattern in people like addicts or people with mental health problems or things like that. And they were saying that, like, I mean, for one thing, I also have to say that Deleuze and Guattari were, in the 1,000 Plateaus, they promote sobriety. They say that the whole, there's things you can do with psychedelics and stuff like that, but at some point in time, you need to learn when the right time just to be straight and sober is, right? And when to, like, and this is with Mars and Saturn, like, you need to know when to pump the brakes. You need to know when to slow down, right? You need to know when not to, like, you don't want to go around a corner so fast you skid out of control, right? And that's not to say you have to stop completely. It doesn't mean you have to stop and turn around and go in the opposite direction, but it's okay to like slow down, take it easy, to not push yourself too hard, but you don't have to give things up entirely, right? And another thing too about starting from the middle is that what they're saying is that if you try to do this thing where you're like, I'm just going to like, this thing isn't working for me, it's not the thing that's going to save my ass, so I have to like start from scratch. What Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that you're never really starting from scratch, because you're always finding yourself in the middle of something, right? And these guys were two French guys, and they use this word, the milieu, and the milieu has multiple meanings. I was reading in the beginning of 1,000 Plateaus that the translator's notes were saying that the milieu means both the being in the midst of something, being in the middle of something, as well as the environment, like the social environment around you, right? Or also, if you take into consider, it also works well with astrology, I think, because you're looking at yourself in the midst of a historical moment, which can be, you could be somebody who doesn't do astrology and just reads it in terms of this is the historical moment you find yourself in, or you could read it in terms of you're in the middle of an astrological dynamic, right? And so if you're going to start something in the middle of an astrological dynamic, you take a look at what the planets are doing, and you can say, oh, look, like we're having a solar eclipse, and Mars, the ruler of Aries, is conjunct Saturn, and Venus has just left that sign as in Aries and all this stuff. And you can say, oh, okay, well, for one thing, if we start something right now in the middle of this situation, of this astrological influence, we can see that there's going to be an intense eclipse energy, and there's a total eclipse too, which is pretty dramatic. And we can see that Mars is running into Saturn, which means it's going to be frustrating, right? So you're not really starting from scratch. You're starting in the middle of a frustrating situation. And if you decide to start in the middle of a frustrating situation, you're going to have to see that, you're going to have to deal with that dynamic one way or another, right? And like I said, there may be things that, like, certain strategies you can apply, which, like, in Saturn could be, like, being a little bit more sober, being a little bit more restrained, or it could also be, showing a bit of your own self-control, pumping the brakes, making sure you don't go too fast around the corner, that kind of stuff. So that was one idea that I had for, and this is like, I'm finding it helpful because I watch a lot of astrology videos from other people, and I'm kind of like, I don't see anybody else talking, obviously mixing Deleuze and Guattari with their astrology. But the thing is, there's kind of a weird contradiction in the sense that, like, if I just tried to conform to really just sticking, all I'm going to do is talk about, like, Rick Tarnas and Chris Brennan and Robert Hand, or, I'm not going to talk about anything outside of astrology for my influences, then it's sort of like, I'm basically just creating the same product that other people are already doing, and other people have already established themselves doing, and other people have already, made a name for themselves doing something better. But at the same time, I don't necessarily want to try to make a name for myself as being a Deleuzian or a Guattarian specifically, but I'm just digging this stuff right now, basically, right? But at the same time, there's this sort of thing that's like, there's something I'm realizing that goes with the sun kind of stuff, right? The solar ego, and also the what you run into doing natal charts for people, why a lot of people come to see astrologers in the first place, and that has to do, like, there's this whole thing about, like, finding your purpose in life or whatever, right? And oftentimes what I've noticed is that a lot of it has to do with setting yourself up with a job or a role to play in society. And I think there can be a lot of pressure on young people who are trying to like get their shit together to figure like when you're a kid going through school, there's a lot of pressure to be like, what do you want to do when you grow up? What is your job gonna be? What's your purpose in life, right? And there's some and what you're supposed to do is find what your passion is, find what you like, right? And then take that thing and then make it the thing. You set yourself, you be like, or like if you're gonna make a YouTube channel or something like that, there are people who like these specific topics, and I'm going to set myself up as one of the guys who, this is how, there's something that to do with neurology. I'm no neuroscientist or anything like that, but there's this basic idea that what fires together wires together, right? And that there are all these associations that like and the more people do this, it'd be like set themselves up on the internet saying this is what this certain thing is about. It creates a sense that you're there. It's like that Deleuze and Guattari have this certain presence online because a certain amount of people decided they somehow identified with these guys, or somehow they wanted to set themselves up as Deleuzian philosophers or Deleuzian theorists or something like that, and they've created a structure that is like people without knowing very much about. If you have never read any of these books, you may have this thing where a name fires an association to something, right? And that is whether that or not that has anything to do with what these people were actually writing, or also whether this has anything to do with the potentials or the possibilities in that writing. There may be other directions you can take it other than what is already established, or what kind of structures people have been building around it, right? And this is similar, like I could also talk about, in terms of Carl Jung or Freud and whatever, right? Like that there are certain distinctions where if you go back to psychoanalysis, Freud was trying to establish this psychoanalytic theory, and Freud kind of has this reputation as being like the daddy figure, right? And he had his sort of understudies, which were people like Carl Jung, Adler, and even like Wilhelm Reich, right? Now, between Jung, Adler, and Reich, each of these guys went off completely in their own direction with it, and and in a way that diverged from what Freud was like, right? And then out of this, you got things like Jung basically created his own kind of school of thought, and there were all these other people who came out of this that were called Jungians, right? And the thing, there's this Terence McKenna video where he gives this speech to, I think it was for a Jungian society, right? But he kind of does this thing at the beginning where he kind of admits that like he's really into Carl Jung, or that Carl Jung was a big influence on Terence McKenna, but he has this distaste for the Jungians, right? But there's this thing about Carl Jung. I don't know if Jung said this himself or somebody said this about Carl Jung, that Carl Jung never wanted to. What he was doing was he didn't want to make his own school of thought called Jungianism, and then have this thing where a whole 100 years later, there are all these people that are carrying on the tradition started by old Daddy Jung, right? And we're like the grandchildren of Carl Jung, right? In the same way that the thing is, like, what Carl Jung wanted to do was talk about reality, right? And say that this shit that Freud is trying to do, that Freud is trying to pass off as being like an objective view of what psychology is like this isn't it. I'm going to try to make something that's more like to approach what that situation, what is actually like, and I disagree with what Freud says, right? So people could be like, I'm more on board with Jung than Freud, and because of that, I consider myself a Jungian rather than a Freudian, right? But the thing is that there's this certain kind of, and there is, like, I have to admit, I really like James Hillman, and James Hillman actually went to Zurich and studied with Jung in person, right? So there is this thing that happens as like the transmission or the inheriting some kind of, but Hillman went on to really do his own thing with it, and that's, I think, what makes Hillman interesting, is that he's not just towing the line of Jungianism, right? And the thing about when you're applying this to Deleuze, like there's this Deleuze and Guattari thing, and I'm talking about like the solar ego or whatever, right, of setting yourself up in this position, is that Deleuze and Guattari were talking about that they had their own, they had this way of talking about it called the molar and the molecular, which I admittedly, when I first heard about it, I was really confused by, and it took me a long time to like figure out exactly what the hell they were talking about. But what they're talking about is that also there's this whole thing about the anti-Oedipus, right? And the whole thing about like the Freudian, this isn't just like the Oedipus Rex thing, it's this thing about making everything about this familialism that colors are thinking, and being like, if I'm a Deleuzian theorist, it's like I'm the little, grandchild of Deleuze, and I'm carrying on and these people have, like, certain people have made this popular, have built this, what you call a molar structure, being like, if you think of it like a castle, we've built this little castle, we've got our walls up, and we anybody coming in from the outside, we sort of, we check them out before we let them into our structure, and we built this thing up, and we got guards at the gate and all this kind of stuff, right? And then, but what Deleuze and Guattari were actually about is like, rather than building up these molar structures, what's going on in the woods outside the castle, right? And that there's some, to me it seems like, if like the way people treat Deleuze and Guattari online, where you're going to be like, I'm going to set myself, we're going to be the Deleuzian guys, or we're going to be the people, we're going to be like the it's also kind of funny, there's this whole thing that they talk about, like the filial or filiation, right? Which is like the idea of using as a metaphor two families that come together and have kids. And this is like, if you go back to like, watch Game of Thrones and stuff like this, or watch, there's this whole thing about how the aristocratic families would use marriage to like seal power, to tie in these power agreements, right? You have one powerful family, another powerful family. Let's join forces, and to do this, we will symbolically marry your daughter with our son, and then we will like be like now you have things like corporate takeovers, right? Or you have these big corporate conglomerates or something like that, right? But it was in a similar way you could look at somebody like Zizek, and the way he does things, like where he says he's like a Marxist, Hegelian, Lacanian, or something like that. It's like, you could treat it as if, it doesn't really work because these are all men, but you could treat it like the Hegel family and the Lacan family got together and have babies, and Zizek is like the child of these two things that came together to make a baby, right? And that if you are following that tradition, you're part of the family, you're part of this lineage, you're part of this line, right? And that there's this whole kind of thing where if you want to be part of that thing, you gotta impress the parents, you gotta show that you're a responsible man, you gotta do all the right things, appeal to the right codes to get in the in group, right? Or else you're outside, and it goes with, I like Game of Thrones as an example of this, because you had like the Starks, right? And you had the Lannisters, and these people in these different structures that were in conflicts with each other, right? In the same way that, like Hegel, or whatever I'm saying, Zizek doesn't seem to like Deleuze very much, right? So you could use that as an example where there are certain theorists come from a certain lineage, and then it's not really based on, they present like it as an argument, but if you look at the way it works, it looks like it's more like Game of Thrones, where you're like, you come from a certain lineage, like it's the Slovenian school where everybody says this, we like these guys, we are all the little kids of these thinkers, and we don't like the people that associate with the other thinkers, and we have these little clans, and we go to war with each other, right? And then meanwhile you've got the wall in the north, right, that you have to set up, and then the people that live beyond this giant wall, you have what is it, the Night's Watch, right? You have where you have this big wall, and this goes with the whole Mars Saturn thing, right? Like and I was doing videos on this back when Saturn was in Aquarius, because I think it kind of maybe it went more. Well, I'm not going to get into that. It goes with the Saturn dynamic, anyways, right? Where you've got this big Saturn wall which blocks off the stuff that you're not even going to talk about. You're not even going to get into it, right? And that is the wildlings, right? You got the wildlings who are the nomads who live in the wilderness beyond the wall, right? And there's a conflict that happens when there's something going on in the north with the White Walkers or whoever they are that push the nomads out of their territory, and the nomads end up storming the Night's Watch, storming the wall. Then they're in the enemy's territory, and they're like the barbarian invaders from the north who are like, like they had these attacks on Rome, right? Like there's a historical precedent for this. How the Roman Empire had this sort of like they had their territory, and then they had the northern barbarians, or the savages, the uncivilized people that were considered, racially inferior even, or outside what's acceptable or whatever, right? And from the point of view of, this is what, it's kind of a faux pas what I'm doing, because from the point, if you're a, an academic theorist, astrology isn't taken very seriously, right? Unless you're doing like Ben Dykes, who I brought up, he is pretty academic, and you can just be like, take a very scholarly approach to just like, you don't have to prove astrology is real or that astrology works. You can go back historically and just like, we're going to look at the source material, and we're going to translate the stuff that these ancient texts into English, and we're going to look at the techniques and see how they work. And if astrologers want to try them out, they can try them out. You don't have to prove that it works or not. It's regardless of whether it's real or not. It's a historical thing, right? And you can still study that academically if you want to, right? But in terms of like, it's one of these things that, like, this is one of the things that Carl Jung was an astrologer. Carl Jung did astrology charts for every single one of his clients, right? But Carl Jung, the actual output, Carl Jung's written output was shaped by the fact that astrology was basically considered, by the academic establishment, astrology was considered something that was going astray. Astrology was something that was deviating off of what is the acceptable, respectable stuff, and just going off. Like, there's this whole thing about the academic institutions tend to look at the New Age and the spiritual and all of that as a bunch of woo-woo stuff that nobody's going to take seriously. And for this reason, one of the things is I'm not setting myself up as a Deleuzian, because I think it's something about, if you actually read what Deleuze and Guattari are saying, and then you're going to be like, okay, I'm going to be like, if Deleuze and Guattari had kids, I'm like their little grandkid. I'm going to be like little baby, like Deleuze and Guattari are like my mom and dad. And then, they wrote this cool book called Anti-Oedipus, which is all about the mummy, daddy, and me. It wasn't that great? Oh, I'm going to make this thing the thing that I do, and I'm going to make that my identity, and then I'm going to say like, I'm like the grandson of Deleuze, right? And it's like, did you actually read the fucking book? Like, oh my God. I don't want to be like, I'm sorry, but this is what's coming up for me recently, right? I don't want to be that offensive about it. Hopefully I'm not putting people off about this. But I'm saying that what Deleuze and Guattari are actually about is rather than being the people who are set up in these weird structures, it's like you're more like the nomad wildlings. But honestly, I have to. Well, I'm still working my way through 1,000 Plateaus. Maybe you can guess if anybody's familiar with this book. Maybe you can guess how far I've made it through. If this is what I'm talking about at this point, right? But for this reason, there's this association that people associations that people have with some of these thinkers based on these structures that people have set up. But the whole point of these thinkers is to be one of the nomads out in the wilderness, not to be camped out in the castle with the king and trying to kiss his ass and trying to be like, oh, and one of the things that I'm noticing is that there's this whole thing going on where there are people who are, people are frustrated with the institutions, people are frustrated with the establishment, but they're not, rather than going off and joining the wildlings, you're just like, you're like crying about how, the Lannisters don't want to have you hang out at their party or whatever, right? And it's like, like that's basically what it feels like, right? You're like, oh, I kind of think the Lannisters are a bit more like Donald Trump though, so that may not be the best example, right? But that the institution of the left wing has set itself up in such a way where, you're going to be outcast like a nomad. You're not going to be in the and this is also funny because like if you keep running with this George R.R. Martin thread, the video I've been playing this video game Elden Ring, which is pretty popular these days. And Elden Ring is like plays off those themes as well because you are the what's the word they use for it? The tarnished. Yeah. It's like you in Elden Ring, your character is a tarnished. So rather than being like you've got all these different knights that are part of these different families that have their different like crests and stuff like that, but you are a knight who's tarnished. You've been outcast from the system, and you are running around as a nomad who launches his own attacks on these fortresses and castles and stuff like that. And using the multiplayer, you can get some other online friends to like join in on your little storm the castle thing if you want, right? Yeah, I don't know. Where am I going? I don't, this is kind of funny is that like I kind of sketched out some notes of like where I was going to go with this, and I didn't expect it to go in such a Game of Thrones George R. R. Martin direction, but it kind of went, but I made some videos. I also have to admit, if you guys want to understand also where I'm coming from with all this, is that there's like this whole thing about, well, maybe I shouldn't, there's not my own, like, do I really want to get into this? It came from, like I had this whole thing, like I was living in Nanaimo a couple of years back, and then I had this whole thing where I had to move back in with my family back on the mainland. And one of the things that I don't know how to explain this, but there was, I don't know if this doesn't make rational sense, but there was the house that I was living with had this Game of Thrones book, right? That was just left there by a old housemate. And when I was leaving the house, the person who owned the house was like, yeah, this is just somebody's book they left here. Do you want this Game of Thrones book? And I'm like, I had this kind of thing about this is the thing, is that when Game of Thrones first came out, I didn't watch it at all because, well, what was going on? I don't know. I can't even remember what year did it start. I can't even remember, right? Maybe it would be better if I knew the actual chronology of when it started. But I had this thing sometimes, like, I was kind of put off by Game of Thrones, but my little sister was really into it at the time. But like, one of the things that happened is that my family has these like little dogs, right? and one of the little dogs is like super sensitive to like every time. There's this thing that every time I turn on the TV, my little dog gets scared and runs away to the other room because she's scared of the TV, right? And then sometimes the dog will, like, while I'm watching TV, if it's something that's not, it's really funny because if the movie isn't having any like suspense or tension in it, the dog will come back and then like sit on the couch and like watch the movie. But then as soon as something like scary or dramatic or tense happens, the dog freaks out and runs away. And one of the thing was that like while my sister was watching Game of Thrones when it was airing, that they all had these dramatic things that would happen. Like my sister would be like, whoa! She'd have these big reactions, and the dog would just freak out about it, right? The dog, like, and I had this idea that, like, you know, there's something about Game of Thrones which has traumatized my little dog, right? And I had this kind of thing that I was going through my own mental health stuff, you know, probably around the time that this show was popular, and I just didn't, like, there's something about the violence and all the sex and stuff, you know, like, and also the mass culture, right? Plugging into the mass culture that I'm like, you know, this influence is not something that I really want to expose myself to. You know, I'm going to be selective of what kind of influences I'm exposing to myself, you know, kind of when I'm in a sort of broken and fragile, vulnerable state, right? But then there's something about like after I came back, you know, I had this health crisis and all this kind of stuff. And as I was recovering from my health crisis, there's the thing about the Game of... The funny thing is, too, is it's not just the Game of Thrones book. It's the well, there was this other thing, too, is that... This is just a minor detail that I'm going to throw in there because I find it interesting, is that I had bought Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy, and I never got around to reading it. But there's something funny is like when I moved all my books back to my parents' house, the one book that went missing was that Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy. So somewhere in Nanaimo, Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus is floating around somewhere, and I hope the right people find it, right? But anyways, there's something about this Game of Thrones book that I had the opportunity to bring home, but I had this like, do I really want to get into that stuff, right? And then I ended up, like, that nagging thing got me watching, I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to go, or there's some other stuff, some other motivations maybe I'm not going to get into, of like, you know what, I'm just going to get, to understand where people are at, I'm going to watch Game of Thrones, and I actually really enjoyed it, right? And I was making videos about Game of Thrones, you know, after I had finished it, to just process it, because whatever, right? I've kind of just gone off on a tangent. I'm realizing there's something about the way this is going. There's also Mercury retrograde in Aries right now. And this sort of like going back and thinking about things that happened and bringing back some of these themes could be the influence of the Mercury retrograde. You know, this is already almost 45 minutes. And I've kind of like, there's certain ideas in here that I'm like, this I feel like there's this something about the Mercury retrograde dynamic in this video. It's like I feel one of the reasons why I'm doing YouTube videos rather than just like trying to write something up like a newsletter to send people, or like doing it as a text composition, is that there's something that I find interesting about if I just sit down and hit record and then let this process unfold, that things come up in way, like it has this way that it has its own, like rather it kind of goes its own direction, right? And that's one of the things that when I make music, there's this idea that, or like when you're painting or something like that, you could have a preconceived idea of what it is you want to put down on the page and what you want to make happen. But then you could also just make a space where you go into it with an idea, but you kind of just create a condition for that thing to grow and turn it to blossom and turn into its own, but you're not telling it exactly what you want it to do, right? You're like, I'm going to create a situation where something can kind of take a form, take a shape, and kind of come into being, but I don't have to be strictly just bossing it around, telling it that, and like I don't have to go in. I'm doing this thing where I'm not even doing edits on these videos, because quite frankly, I like doing this better. I like having this thing where you don't know where it's gonna go exactly. That like it could take its own shape. It could it could start as maybe a line of flight even into a different direction you weren't even expecting, right? And that is actually more interesting. That's more exciting for me than being like, oh, did I have to record this, and did I get what I wanted? Did I achieve my preconceived goal that I had before sitting down to make this video or not? And to be honest, this video has gone in a completely different direction than what I was expecting when I sat down to record it, which I find kind of interesting. And I'm embracing that part of the process in my videos. And I hope you guys like it as well, because I'm going to keep doing it. So anyways, thanks for your support, everybody. Thanks for coming with me on this journey where I venture outside the walls of the castle into the wilderness and bring back some interesting artifacts from the wildlings. All right, thank you very much. See you next time.